This episode is brought to you by Google Gemini. With the Gemini app, you can talk live and have a real-time conversation with an AI assistant. It's great for all kinds of things, like if you want to practice for an upcoming interview, ask for advice on things to do in a new city, or brainstorm creative ideas. And by the way, this script was actually read by Gemini. Download the Gemini app for iOS and Android today. Must be 18 plus to use Gemini Live.
Chronic migraine is 15 or more headache days a month, each lasting 4 hours or more.
Botox, onabotulinum toxin A, prevents headaches in adults with chronic migraine. It's not for adults with migraine with 14 or fewer headache days a month. It prevents, on average, 8 to 9 headache days a month versus 6 to 7 for placebo.
Prescription Botox is injected by your doctor. Effects of Botox may spread hours to weeks after injection, causing serious symptoms. Alert your doctor right away, as difficulty swallowing, speaking, breathing, eye problems, or muscle weakness can be signs of a life-threatening condition. Patients with these conditions before injection are at highest risk. Side effects may include allergic reactions, neck and injection site pain, fatigue, and headache. Allergic reactions can include rash, welts, asthma symptoms, and dizziness. Don't receive Botox if there's a skin infection. Tell your doctor your medical history, muscle or nerve conditions, including ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, myasthenia gravis or Lambert-Eaton syndrome, and medications, including botulinum toxins, as these may increase the risk of serious side effects.
Ask your doctor and visit BotoxChronicMigraine.com or call 1-800-44-BOTOX to learn more.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I'm very pleased to welcome back to the show for the first time in a really long time, Anne Garthwaite. Annie, welcome back.
Hi, lovely to be here. You're looking very well.
Oh, thank you. It's so nice to have you and to be able to sit here and chat with you and see you. Thank goodness for modern technology, right?
Yes, exactly. You'd never believe there's an ocean between us.
Yeah, you wouldn't, honestly. The last time you were on our show, Annie, I think you were interviewed by Steph. That sound, I don't know. You've probably done hundreds of interviews, so you probably have no idea what I'm talking about. But
I think you're right.
Okay.
Back in 2021 when Cecily came out.
Yes. So today our topic of the show is going to be primarily Cecily Neville, but I'd also like to maybe say and the women of the Wars of the Roses. Is that fair?
Yeah, you should absolutely say that, because my second novel, The King's Mother, really does embrace 4 of the big women of the Wars of the Roses. You know, the first book, Cecily focused on Cecily, but the second book really opens up the panorama to look at these 4 women who, during the Wars of the Roses, competed with each other for that title of King's Mother.
I love this. Okay, so let's start out. Let's just go back to the beginning, because as a writer myself, I'm not a very good historical fiction writer. I'm terrible. I am so much better at nonfiction. So I'm amazed at anybody who can write historical fiction well, because you have to be a storyteller. You have to be able to paint the scene. How do you get inspired when you sit down to start writing on a subject, especially, let's say, Cecily? How do you get inspired to write about this person and be able to paint these pictures?
Yeah, I guess the inspiration with these 2 novels has never been a problem for me, because I have been obsessed by Cecily Neville and these 3 other women since I was in my teens. And that's a very long time ago. So I'm never short on the inspiration. And the story of the Wars of the Roses, as you know, is just a complete and utter blockbuster. You know, it is full of action and twists and turns and betrayals and, you know, falls from grace. But it's a fabulous, fabulous, if somewhat complicated story. But I guess the inspiration for me, or the reason that I was so keen to write these novels, is that there's been lots and lots written about the Wars of the Roses, but always through the eyes of the men. You know, the kings and princes and earls and dukes and traitors and all of that good stuff. But we've ignored the women as if they had no real role to play, as if they were, you know, at best observers of the conflicts and at worst the victims of the conflicts. But in actuality, these 4 women were drivers of the Wars of the Roses. They were 100% involved, invested, and they were driving the action. They were active participants in the Wars of the Roses. And once you realize that, everything changes.
How do you decide on a personality? I know it might be a weird question, but that's the thing that you have to kind of do when you're writing this type of story, is decide what kind of personality this figure had.
These people have. Yeah, you do. Absolutely. And I think, and that, I guess, is something that came to me over years and years of being interested in these women, of writing, of reading about them and thinking about them incessantly. I guess over that time, their personality begins to formulate in your mind. And I think the key characteristics of all four of the women that they share are intelligence, dynamism, ambition, and motherhood. All four of these women are mothers, and you know what it's like. You're a mother yourself. You know, the big question at the heart of the second book, The King's Mother, is what will a mother do for her son? Or turn it on its head, what won't she do? You know, if you think your son or your child is in danger, what won't you do to get them out of it? Who won't you betray? What won't you put at risk? It's a really short list.
It really is.
And that's what binds all of these four women together and makes them so fascinating. And, you know, there are elements of their personalities that differ beyond that, but that central driving force of motherhood and maternal protection and maternal ambition drives all four of them. And over the course of this novel and over the course of the history, they were each driven to do really quite questionable things in order to preserve the throne or gain the throne for their son and to become king's mother themselves. And I think what happens when, and you know it particularly with the Wars of the Roses, which tend to be so partisan, you know, you're either a Yorkist or a Lancastrian, and if you're a Yorkist, then Cecily Neville is marvellous, and Margaret Beaufort is a terrible woman, you know, and vice versa if you're on the other side. You know, everyone is good or bad, angelic or demonic, white hats, black hats. And what I wanted to do was get beyond that simple and false viewpoint and realize that these women were neither good nor bad. They were just complicated. And they were doing what they needed to do to survive. And all four of them, in the course of the novel, will betray each other terribly. They won't do it because they want to do it. They'll do it because they need to do it for their kids. And it will cost them dear to do it, you know, both in terms of the immediate price this side of heaven and in the afterlife.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to me.
This time period of history was my first love before I fell in love with the Tudors. How do you not just get entranced in the Wars of the Roses and all the drama that goes with it? Yeah. Let's talk about the women in this novel, because obviously we know you talk about Cecily Neville, but who are the other women that you focus on? Who are the other king's mothers?
Okay, so Cecily is first of all, and she is the matriarch of the House of York and becomes the mother. She's the mother of Edward IV and Richard III, the two great Yorkist kings. And we've met her in the first novel, and the story in the second novel continues through her viewpoint. And I often say to people, the first novel is about how Cecily builds a dynasty, and the second book is about how the kids mess it up.
Isn't that the truth?
Isn't that the truth? Isn't that just typical? So there's Cecily, right dead center of the story. The other three women, the first one is Margaret of Anjou. and she was the French queen of Henry VI, the king that Edward IV kind of defeated and took over from. And by the time that happens, which is at the opening of the king's mother, Edward has just taken the throne. Marguerite is down. She's been booted off her throne and out of her kingdom, but she is definitely not out. Because her husband may be of very little use to her, but she has a son. And she is prepared to do just about anything to regain the throne for her boy. And Cecily, who's known Marguerite since Marguerite was 15 years old when she first came to England to marry Henry VI, knows exactly how hard Marguerite will fight. Mm-hmm. She knows her well. They've known each other for that whole sort of 15, 20-year period. So at the beginning of the novel, when Cecily is sitting there comfortably as king's mother with Edward IV on the throne, she knows that Marguerite is the clear and present danger, the immediate threat that she faces. And through the course of the novel, Marguerite will, in sheer desperation, ally with her mortal enemy, the Earl of Warwick, to launch an invasion of England to try and regain the throne for her son. So that's the first one of them. The second one is Elizabeth Woodville. And Elizabeth Woodville becomes Edward IV's queen. And you've probably seen that glorious portrait of her. She's reputed to be one of the most beautiful women of her generation. And she was stunning. But she was not the woman that Edward IV should have married. You know, at the time, she was, a lot of people say she was a commoner, but she wasn't. She was a noble, but not terribly. And she was certainly several rungs below where you would expect a king to marry. She was older than Edward by 5 years. She was already a widow. Her first husband had been killed fighting against Edward in the recent wars. She had 2 children by that marriage. So suddenly the king is a stepfather. There's all sorts of... She brings nothing to the marriage in terms of political advantage or a dowry, which he badly needed because he was broke, or political connections or anything of that kind. She just brings a big family of siblings, sisters and brothers, who all need to be given titles and wealth and lands and so on in order to elevate them and make them good enough to be the king's family. And perhaps expecting what his mother's reaction to this marriage might be, Edward marries her in secret and doesn't tell anyone.
I love that.
Until he has to. And it all comes to light when the Earl of Warwick, the King Edward's cousin, has been in France negotiating a marriage with a French princess for Edward, with Cecily's support and with Edward's tacit agreement. And he comes back from France and says, "Done deal, just sign here, Edward. Happy wedding day." And Edward has to put his hand up and say, "I think there's something I need to tell you.
I have a confession.
I have a confession to make. I've already married Elizabeth Woodville." Shock, horror. And it was the kind of scandal of the day. And you can imagine how pleased Cecily was not. But, people say that people sort of speculate that Cecily and Elizabeth must have been enemies from the get-go because Cecily didn't want that marriage. But there's no evidence for that. All the evidence is that once she'd got over her fit of pique about it, Cecily kind of, it was a fait accompli. So she just had to get on with it, really. And the last thing that she wanted to do was destabilize the dynasty by disputing the marriage. And there's lots of evidence that she supported Elizabeth, that she sided with her, that she loaned her staff and resources and helped her. She wasn't prepared for queenship, so she helped her to sort of fit into that role. It was much later when relations between Cecily and Elizabeth turned sour. So I won't say too much about how all of that does turn sour, but suffice to say that when Elizabeth's husband, Edward, IV, Cecily's son, dies unexpectedly at the age of 40, she will go so far as to attempt a coup and the assassination of Richard III in order to preserve the throne for her two young sons that she has given Edward IV. So she's an absolute fighter too. And then the last one, who will be very close to your heart, of course, is Margaret Beaufort. And, you know, in the writing of these novels, my admiration for Margaret Beaufort has grown and grown and grown, because she's so extraordinary. And, you know, she doesn't have the best start in life. She is orphaned when she's 9 months old, when her father dies, and she is left a very valuable heiress on the marriage market. And Henry VI, when she's 12 years old, marries her to his half-brother Edmund Tudor. And it's really a way of the king giving Edmund Tudor land and titles and da-da-da-da-da, without the king actually having to spend any money. He just gets Margaret. But there's a problem. And, you know, marriages of that kind are not unusual. Girls regularly married at 12 and younger, but usually those marriages wouldn't be consummated until the girl was 15 or 16, you know, when she was more sexually mature. But there was a problem with the way that Margaret's marriage contract was written, which meant that if she died...
Okay, I have to tell you, I was just looking on eBay, where I go for all kinds of things I love, and there it was.
That hologram trading card. One of the rarest, the last one I needed for my set. Shiny like the...
designer handbag of my dreams. One of a kind. eBay had it, and now everyone's asking, ooh, where'd you get your...
windshield wipers. eBay has all the parts that fit my car. No more annoying... just beautiful.
Whatever you love, find it on eBay. eBay. Things people love.
This episode is brought to you by AWS. Amazon Q Business is the new generative AI assistant from AWS. Many tasks can make business slow, like wading through mud. Help! Luckily, there's a faster, easier, less messy choice. Amazon Q can securely understand your business data to help you streamline tasks, like summarizing quarterly results or doing complex analyses in no time. Q got this. Learn what Amazon Q Business can do for you at aws.com/learn more.
Died before she'd had a child, so before there was issue from the marriage, Edmund would get nothing and everything would revert back to the crown. So Edmund was very determined that there should be issue from the marriage as quickly as possible. So at 12 years old, he took her to bed and he got her pregnant. And she gave birth to her son, Henry Tudor, remember that name, when she was barely 13. And she was already by then a widow because Edmund had conspired to die of the plague in the meantime. So all his plans went well, didn't they? Not really. So she is left a widow at 13 with a son. And although we know she marries twice more after Edmund's death, she never has another child. And the sort of speculation is that perhaps she was so damaged by that early pregnancy that she could never conceive again. We don't know that for sure, but that's the thinking. But despite that, her bond with her son seems to be intense. You know, I love the way she always refers to him in her letters as my one desired joy in all the world, my beloved son. You know, there's a great tenderness in their correspondence. And again, too detailed to go into here, but by the time he's 10 years old, he's in exile in Brittany and France. So she doesn't see him for 14 years until he returns to England at the head of an army. And for that 14 years, she holds a candle for him. She works consistently and endlessly and tirelessly to bring him home. Not necessarily as king. I don't think that was always her plan. She just wanted him home with the title of Earl of Richmond, which was his due. And she would have settled for that. And the great tragedy of it is that she was on the brink of achieving that. Working with Edward IV, she'd managed to put together a deal with Brittany that would allow her boy to come back. Then Edward goes and dies. and the whole plan is, kicked out of the court. And she's desperate. And then I think in the chaos of Richard III's rule, his short rule, she sees an opportunity and she takes it. And the great thing about Margaret Beaufort, I think, is, she has such courage. She must have had nerves of steel. And people call her the mother of the Tudor dynasty. And she is, not just because she gave birth to Henry VII, but because she put him on the throne. She took all the risks. She put that army together. It was her planning and her plotting and her cleverness that allowed him to come and invade. So did Henry Tudor beat Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth? Yes. Or did Margaret Beaufort beat Cecily?
Oh, I love that.
Well, without his mother, he'd never have got to the battlefield.
Yes.
And when you think of the risks that she took in 1483 and 1484 to bring that about, it makes my blood run cold. She must have had nerves of absolute steel, I think. And all of that brings us to another really important point about these four women, I think. As I said, I've been fascinated by these women for the best part of 40 years. And yet it was years before it really dawned on me that these four women all knew each other and knew each other really well. And once I'd realized that, I thought, well, am I really stupid? How did I not realize that? And I think it's because of the way history is taught and written. And history is written about, by and large, about the blokes, the men. Yeah. And only refers to the women in so much as they relate to the men. So Cecily is Edward IV's mum, and she's Richard III's mum, and Margaret is Henry Tudor's mum, and Elizabeth Woodville is Edward IV's queen, and so on and so forth. But what were they to each other? No, they were intimate. All four of them are bound together by ties of family and friendship and political allegiance. Margaret of Anjou and Cecily had known each other since Marguerite was 15 years old. When Marguerite was queen, Cecily was England's premier noblewoman. They had a very good working relationship for years until everything went sour. When Edward confessed that he'd married Elizabeth Woodville, Cecily wasn't saying, "Who the hell is Elizabeth Woodville?" She was saying, "Why on earth have you married her?" She knew Elizabeth Woodville since she was born. Elizabeth's mother, Jacquetta of Bedford, and Cecily had known each other since they were each 16. They'd met in France when their husband, when they were in France together, and then again spent time in France together when both of their husbands were stationed there. And it was a time when they were both young wives, having lots of children, starting their families. And they were part of that sort of small English enclave in Rouen. They would have known each other intimately. And, Elizabeth Woodville, 5 years older than Edward. And Edward was born during that time in France. You can almost imagine the 5-year-old Elizabeth Woodville peering over the cradle at the newborn Edward, who she will eventually marry.
Yeah.
So, so Cecily and Elizabeth and Jacquetta all knew each other really well. And Margaret Beaufort, Cecily and Margaret first meet in 1431 as the king's mother opens. And there is very clear evidence of them being very good friends. They get on well together, they correspond, they meet, they socialize together, they loan each other books and servants and so on. They have a relationship, I think, of mutual confidence and trust. Mm. And they're really alike. And, Margaret is that bit younger. She's the next generation down. And it's clear to me that she looks up at Cecily as a sort of role model, a bit of a mentor. She says in the novel, she says at one point, I've been studying your game for years. They know each other so well. And that means that when these four women do betray each other, and they all do, it's not like you're having a pop at a distant enemy. You're driving the knife into the ribs of someone you've known and cherished and had a relationship with.
Yeah.
And that costs, doesn't it?
What a difficult situation to be in.
Yeah. And I think Margaret Beaufort was the knife in the dark that Cecily didn't see coming. She was the one woman that Cecily thought she could trust. And ultimately, Margaret was the ultimate betrayer.
Do you think Margaret also saw Cecily as a role model of some sort?
Yes, definitely. Absolutely. And you can see it in the way that she conducts herself as King's mother. Cecily, when Cecily's son Edward becomes king, Cecily is the first woman to take on that title of King's mother as a sort of formal title rather than a sort of biological fact. She becomes Lady Cecily, the King's mother. Mm-hmm. And Margaret does exactly the same when her son Henry VII becomes king. And you can see the way that she conducts herself in that role, the way she manages herself in that role, is absolutely a repeat of Cecily's. She models her behavior on Cecily's. And there's a lot in common, again, there's a lot in common in the way that both of the mothers, Margaret and Cecily, work with their sons when their sons first become king. Because when Edward becomes king, he's 18 years old. Didn't expect to be king. Suddenly he is. He's really good at fighting. Mm-hmm. And very handsome, but politically quite inexperienced, whereas Cecily is in her mid-40s. She's been playing the political game all her life. So she is very much Edward's guide and confidant, and there's a very close relationship between the two of them. You can see him relying on her for counsel and advice, and she takes on quite a prominent role, particularly in the early years of his rule while he's sort of finding his feet. And then for different reasons, Margaret has to do the same for Henry, because when Henry comes to England and fights the Battle of Bosworth and wins it, he hasn't been in England for 14 years. He doesn't know England. He wouldn't know where the bus stops are. He'd be completely stymied. Margaret, very experienced, moving in the high political echelons for decades by this time, and very familiar with England, of course. And it's totally clear that she is the driving force behind the early years of Henry's kingship and sort of steering the ship. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think that was a truth that Margaret learned from Cecily.
That's amazing. I want to talk, obviously, The King's Mother is the name of the book. But she, Cecily also had two other sons that are very well known to history. And obviously Richard III became king as well. But I want to talk about Cecily's relationship with Edward, George, and Richard. And I think I heard you in another interview make comparisons with Edward and George with William and Harry.
Yes. I think George is to Edward what Harry is to William.
I love that comparison because I think it's probably pretty spot on.
He's the number two. He's the spare.
Yeah.
And he can't bear it. And he just doesn't know what to do with himself. He just can't bear it. And he's vain and he's weak-headed and he's foolish. And he repeatedly enters into acts of treason against his brother. So it's a much more serious game than the one played now between William and Harry, because the worst that Harry can do to William really is drag his name through the gutter in the national press. William and his whole family come to that. But for George and Edward, it was about killing them. There were so many times when Cecily knew that her two sons were going to war, fighting on opposite sides, And what's that like as a mother? How do you even, there's a point in the book where she says, I don't even know what to pray for. How do I pray for either outcome and not be damned for it because one of my sons is going to lose in this battle? And I found myself wondering a lot about what happens to a mother's love in those circumstances. Does a mother's love eventually die, or does it just become ever more painful? Ever more intensely painful. And the way that plays out with George and Edward is just fascinating and tragic.
It's so tragic. I can never, I didn't live then, obviously. It was a different time to live. And to understand what was going on in George's mind. Did he not understand what the risk was? I don't know. And I feel like maybe there isn't even enough known about George in order to understand him as a man. What were you finding in your research about this time period?
Well, he was, I've described him as vain and weak-headed, and I think he was both of those things. But I did find myself increasingly wondering whether there was a level of mental instability with George, because the risks were terrible and his chances of success slim, and he was so impressionable and he was so easily led by his cousin, the Earl of Warwick, of course, who also, and you do wonder about him. The relationship between him and Edward is fascinating. To me, it's a bit like a bromance that has gone wrong. And the Earl of Warwick is fed up and pissed off with Edward for all kinds of good reasons, like because he married Elizabeth Woodville and he's elevated all of these nobles that makes Warwick angry and envious. That he embarrassed him in front of the French king when he married Elizabeth Woodville instead of this excellent marriage that Warwick had given so much to negotiate for him. But he also rebels because he thinks for some reason Edward doesn't love him anymore. They've been, in their early life, Warwick was a bit older, Edward the younger boy, and I think a bit of hero worship between Edward and Warwick there, and Warwick's used to being the sort of the older guy and the guiding light, and he expected that to continue once Edward became king. But of course that was never going to happen because Edward had grown up and needed to come out from Warwick's shadow. And Warwick didn't have the emotional intelligence, I think, to realize that that was what was happening. And it was just like, but Edward, don't you love me anymore? And I'm going to poke you and I'm going to poke you and I'm going to poke you until you tell me you love me. It's, you just want to take these men and crash their heads together because they're so foolish.
Most definitely. I feel so sorry for Cecily. Like you said, she was in such a difficult position to have her two sons fighting against one another. And then George is executed. Edward goes on to reign for a decent amount of time afterwards. He suddenly passes away. Her grandson is going to be put on the throne, but wait, her other son comes into the picture. And I think the interesting part to me is that I forget how long Cecily lived, because she experienced all of that and into the Tudor period. So let's go back and talk about the experience for her after Edward died, and then everything with Edward V and Richard III.
Yes. What was Cecily's part in Richard III's ascension to the throne, and what were her feelings about it? The one thing that is very clear to me is that Cecily 100% supported Richard's bid for the throne. In that crucial summer of 1483, when a few things happen in really short order. Edward dies. He leaves Richard as protector for his 2 young boys. Within a matter of weeks, those 2 young boys are declared illegitimate, and they kind of disappear. And suddenly Richard III is sitting on the throne instead of them.
Yeah.
And if that was a political situation today, you would say, well, the optics don't look good for Richard, right?
No, right.
Don't. But in that crucial few weeks, in that summer of 1483, when Richard came to London as protector to the boys, and until he became king, his centre of operations, he was working out of his mother's house on the Thames, Baynard's Castle.
Interesting.
There's no way she wasn't hand in glove with him in what he was doing. And that raises all kinds of questions about what did Cecily know about Edward's sons and their legitimacy. And you have to remember that when it comes to secret marriages, Edward had form. He married Elizabeth Woodville in secret. Who else did he marry in secret? And the whole theory of him having this pre-marriage, this earlier marriage with Eleanor Talbot, to me is very compelling. And historians, male historians, have turned themselves inside out and back to forth to try and work out how Richard III might have found out about the Eleanor Talbot marriage, who might have let the cat out of the bag, and how. Well, it's obvious, isn't it? The women would have known.
Right.
And Eleanor Talbot was married, Eleanor Talbot's sister was married into Cecily's family. So at some point back in 1464, are we in, when he's carrying on with Eleanor Talbot? Somebody is going to come to Cecily and say, do you know what your Edward's up to with my Eleanor?
Yeah.
Now, in the 1460s, it's very much in Cecily's interests to make that marriage disappear.
Yes.
To keep that secret. In 1483, when her relationship with the Woodvilles has broken down and the Woodvilles are in rebellion against her son Richard III and opposing his protectorship, it might just be very much in her interest to make it known. I can't prove any of that, but it's my theory.
I think that's so fascinating. I love the politics and the relationships of this time period. I'm obsessed with Elizabeth Woodville as much as I am with Margaret Beaufort. Elizabeth Woodville, do you think she was inspired more by her mother or by Cecily?
My feeling is that Elizabeth didn't know how to trust anybody, really. And I think that, and to be honest, I don't blame her. When you look at the treatment that Elizabeth Woodville got from Cecily's family, the Earl of Warwick, Cecily's nephew, kills, and Cecily's son George, kill her father and her brother. They repeatedly rebel against Edward IV, endangering him, endangering her, killing members of her family. They have her mother arrested on trumped-up witchcraft charges. So she's not going to be overly trusting of Cecily's family and Cecily and Edward's brothers. She couldn't trust George. Why should she trust Richard? And then if Edward was bigamous and she found that out, what a terrible betrayal. What a terrible betrayal. So I can't, putting myself in her head, I can quite understand how in 1483 she feels utterly trapped, victimized, and at the mercy of Cecily's family. and with her back against the wall, she's going to fight. And that's Elizabeth's tragedy, I think, because I believe the two people that she could have trusted were Richard and Cecily.
Mm.
But her failure to do so led her into direct opposition to them. And at that point, as far as Cecily was concerned, the minute Elizabeth threatened her son, all bets were off.
Yeah. Oh, the story! I just I'm speechless because I just feel so much for these women and what they had to go through during this time, and we haven't even touched yet on Margaret of Anjou and her life, because that's equally as tragic as all of these other women and everything that they went through. So let's talk about Margaret, or Marguerite, as you call her. And
I call her Marguerite. I give her her French variation to make it easy to keep her and Margaret Beaufort clear in people's minds.
It's clever and perfect because it makes sense. So she comes to France when she is 15. She marries Henry VI. And remind me, how long did it take before they had their son?
Oh, it was 8-9 years before she had a son.
Wow, yeah.
And, you know, it has to be said that as far as kings go, Henry VI was pretty close to the top of the useless pile.
He was.
Both as a king and a husband, really. He was weak, ineffectual, surrounded by corruption, and, you know, he was not a ruler. And he wasn't overly fond of women. And Marguerite did manage to get her son, but it isn't 100% clear that Henry fathered that child. He was also prone to bouts of insanity, and the boy was born during one of his fits of insanity. And when he came back to his senses and was presented with the child, he said, "All my prayers have been answered. Surely this child was conceived by the Holy Ghost." The subtext being, because it wasn't me.
Right. It's our miracle baby.
A miracle baby. And Henry VI did have this sort of belief that if he prayed for something hard enough, it would happen.
Oh, yeah, you could do that.
So, you know, did she resort to desperate measures in order to get a son, an heir for England? I don't know. We've no way of knowing now. We can't go back and do retrospective DNA tests on anybody to know. But suffice to say, it was a rumor at the time. And suffice to say that I think Cecily believed it.
Yeah. Well,
and again, a bit like Margaret, later, you know, Marguerite, she's got her one chick in her nest. She's going to do whatever it takes for him, you know.
Yes.
And it ends very, very, very badly. She allies herself with the Earl of Warwick and with George, and they're ultimately defeated, and her son is lost. And she dies in France. She's ransomed back to the French by Edward, and she goes back to France and lives in relative penury. It's tragic, her life, I think. And she just lost everything, lost big time.
Yeah, and her reputation throughout history has been what? The she-wolf, which I think is terrible to pinhole her just as that, because all of these women were strong in their own way, right?
Absolutely. And the other thing to remember too is that, you know, when her husband is insane and her son is very young, she stands up and says, well, I should be regent and act on their behalf as queen. And everyone in England goes, oh, are you mad? A woman? A French woman? Because we're a bit like that, we English. Whereas in the French court, that would have been a perfectly acceptable thing to happen. Her aunt, who was Queen of France, acted as regent for her husband when he was indisposed. So all of these English would have been throwing their hats in the air in horror and looking at her as if she was a monster, and she'd have been going, what is the matter with these people? This is just the common sense thing to do, you know. So, yeah, poor Margaret. And of course, as a French queen and for a long time a barren French queen, she was very unpopular in the country, unfairly so, really. When she was married to Henry VI, the hope was that it would rejuvenate English interests in France and that, but in fact, the opposite of that happened and England lost virtually all of its French holdings during that time. So she was always on the losing side as a Queen of England. Yeah.
Was she, I wonder if I have this correct now. Was she the last foreign queen before Catherine of Aragon?
Yes, she was. Yes, because you've got Edward who marries Elizabeth Woodville and Eleanor Talbot.
Yeah.
And then you have Henry VII, of course, who marries Edward's daughter, Margaret of York.
Yeah.
So it's only when Prince Arthur, and then Henry VIII marry Catherine of Aragon that we have a foreign queen.
Yeah, I'm sure there's lots of reasons behind why that was. And of course, it's usually political. But I don't know, that just came into my head. And I was like, she was the last foreign bride before Catherine of Aragon. Like there was something to say like, okay, well, let's just keep it in the country for a while.
Yes.
We know how our subjects react when we have a foreign bride.
Yeah, it doesn't go well. Yeah.
No.
But of course, Edward IV should have married Bonner of Savoy. That was the deal on the table.
Yes, it was. One of the other things that you mentioned that I was just thinking about was something else Cecily and Elizabeth Woodville had in common. Cecily lost her husband and her son, and Elizabeth lost her father and brother.
Yes.
There was so much loss. All of these women experienced so many losses close to them.
Yes. And there are so many mirrors. I mean, that's a definite mirror. The other one that always sticks in my mind is that Cecily lost her second son, Edmund, at the same time as she lost her husband. And Edmund was 17 years old in his first battle. And he dies. Marguerite loses her son in his first battle when he's 17 years old.
Oh my gosh.
Fighting each other.
Yeah. Annie, I feel like the Wars of the Roses and all of these women are so absolutely fascinating to me. And I want people to make sure that they go out and buy both of your books. Because you are, you are a brilliant writer. You are a great storyteller. And
thank you so much.
This part of history needs to be told over and over and over. Before we go, I have to ask you the question. I don't know how many times people have asked you this. Who do you think, or what do you think happened to the princes in the tower?
Well, again, I think Cecily has the key to answering this question, which is, I think in the summer of 1483, she's saying to Richard, we don't need to kill these boys. There's another way to do this. And if you go back a few more generations in history, when Henry IV first took the crown from the weak, ineffectual King Richard II, Henry IV, of course, being Cecily's mother's half-brother.
Right.
When Henry IV took the throne, there were two other young boys in England, the Mortimer brothers, who clearly had a better claim than Henry. But they were young boys. At the time, there was no strong male in the Mortimer family at that moment to protect their interests. Nobody wanted them, a boy, to be king when they had this marvelous, strapping Henry IV. So their claim was kind of swept under the carpet. So what does Henry IV do? They are clearly sitting there with better claims to the throne than him. They are clearly a threat. Does he kill them? No. He takes them into fairly loose custody. There is then an attempt to rescue them or abduct them and launch a rebellion on their behalf. And after that, it's quickly quashed. And after that, Henry's learned his lesson and he keeps them much more secretly that they can't be got at. One of those boys dies fairly young anyway of natural causes, so it doesn't matter. But the other goes on to be a loyal servant to Henry IV, has a full life, dies in the end fighting for the crown in Ireland. And he is so faithful to Henry IV, that when someone else mounts a rebellion on his behalf, he goes to Henry and says, I just want you to know that this is happening and that it's got nothing to do with me.
Smart.
Now, the person who is mounting that rebellion and ends up losing his head for it is Cecily's husband's father. It's all connected. So she's got a blueprint for how you cope with the princess in the tower. She knows exactly what to do. She's saying to Richard, we don't need to kill them. We just need to go to Henry IV's plan B, where we keep them in close custody and we don't tell anyone where they are.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Annie, I just had Dr. Lacey Bonar Hall on the show to talk about the women surrounding the mystery of the princes in the tower. And she talks a lot about Cecily and her daughter, Margaret of York, and how she has this belief that they were both involved. And there's like some money that was exchanged that kind of just disappeared that could have been money to help secure
there's money sent off to Burgundy and it's by Richard and it's very unclear what that money is for.
Yes.
And, this is the thing. If you turn history on its head and you look at it from the women's point of view, some of these great mysteries about the Wars of the Roses change.
Yes.
Because when you understand the motivations of the women, the actions of the men start to make a lot more sense. And when you join the dots and say, well, what did the women know? What were the women doing? It changes everything.
It really.
I am sure that Cecily was working with Richard, supported his kingship, realized that, a young Woodville boy on the throne would not be a good thing. And I'm sure she was advising Richard what to do. And her advice to him was, take those boys somewhere quiet. Put them amongst people we know are loyal to us and can bring them up. We've got a few more years to do what Henry IV so successfully did with the Mortimer boy and reconcile them to their new position. It was a gamble.
Yeah.
But it was a gamble I think she would have taken. I don't think she's going to be sitting there saying, we've got to kill Edward's sons.
Right. Wow. Annie, oh my gosh, this has been so much fun chatting with you on this subject today. If people want to go out and get your books, where can they find them?
Well, anywhere, really. On any online retailers and in independent bookshops and so on, they're all there. Actually, there's one bookshop in the UK at the moment that is running a fabulous pre-Christmas offer where if you order it before the 15th of December, I will personally sign and dedicate it and it will get sent to you in time for Christmas Day. And that's Booker Books, Booker with an A on the end, Books. Look them up online. They will deliver to you. But yes, absolutely any bookshop or Amazon or all those online retailers have it. Any trouble getting hold of it, get in touch with me. AnneGarthwaite.com.
And Annie, you're on social media too, right? If people want to have a chat with you.
I am. I'm on socials as I'm on Instagram, Blue Sky, and Twitter as Anne Garthwaite, and on Facebook as Anne Garthwaite Writer. Yeah, so I'm easy to track down, and my website is AnneGarthwaite.com, and you can email me directly from the website too. So.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Annie.
Oh, it's been a complete joy. I mean, I could literally talk about these women for hours. So you've got off quite lightly, really.
Oh, I could do it as well, but I don't think our listeners have the patience for a 3-hour episode. Thanks again.
You're very welcome. Take care.
And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. Over there, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, and some patron-exclusive content as well. If you would prefer to show your support in another way, head on over to my website, tudorsdynasty.com, and click on the shop to see some of the new merchandise that I have available. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.